4 continents, different languages, different centuries, the same creature. In the Pacific Northwest, they call it Sasquatch. In the Himalayas, they call it the Yeti. In the highlands of New South Wales, the Yowie. In the Caucasus Mountains, the Almas. 4 creatures separated by oceans and ice ages, by religions and languages and entire centuries of human history. And every one of them is described the same way. 7 to 10 feet tall, covered in dark hair, walking upright, watching from the tree line, almost human but not quite. Now here's the part that should bother you. The Aboriginal Australians who told the first stories of the Yowie had never met a Tibetan monk. The Salish elders of the Pacific Northwest had never spoken with a shepherd in Mongolia. These cultures didn't share books, didn't share oral traditions, didn't share trade routes. They couldn't have copied each other if they tried. And yet they all describe the same creature. In the year 77 AD, almost 2,000 years ago, a Roman naturalist named Pliny the Elder sat down to write his natural history, one of the first scientific encyclopedias in human history. In it, he records a story he'd been told about the mountains of India, a creature that walked on 2 legs, tall, covered in hair, almost a man but not quite. Pliny had no concept of an ape, no theory of evolution, no idea that a continent called Australia even existed, let alone that the people living there were describing the same thing he was writing down. He just recorded what he heard. And the description he gave in the 1st century AD, almost word for word, matches what hikers in the Blue Mountains of Australia will tell you they saw last week. So how is that possible? That's what this video is about.
Hey everyone, I'm Alex. Most of what we cover on this channel happens in North American forests, Sasquatch, trail cam footage, and the cases we've all gotten to know. Today is different. Today we leave the continent and look at the grand picture. Settle in.
Let's start with the one most of you already know, the one I've spent more time on this channel covering than any other. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the big man in the woods. For anyone watching for the first time, and welcome, by the way, the basic description is consistent across thousands of sightings. 7 to 10 feet tall, 2 to 3 feet across at the shoulders. Covered in dark brown, black, or sometimes reddish-brown hair. Bipedal, walks upright, no knuckle dragging. A face that's somewhere between a gorilla and a Neanderthal. And a smell that witnesses describe as something between wet dog, sewage, and rotting meat. That last detail is one of the most consistent threads in modern reports, and it's one of the reasons I personally lean toward believing the creature is biological rather than something more exotic. Biological creatures have biological smells. The name Sasquatch comes from an anglicization of Saskats, a word from the Halkomelem language spoken by the Stis Isles people of British Columbia. But every indigenous tradition across North America has a name for this thing. The Choctaw called it Champe, the Lumi Tsemekwes, the Lakota Chietanka, the Iroquois Otneyarhe, meaning stone giant. More than 100 distinct names across more than 100 distinct nations, every one of them describing the same creature, long before any Europeans set foot on the continent. And here's a detail I think gets glossed over in most cryptid coverage. The Halkomelem word Saskats is usually translated as wild man of the woods, but the linguistic root carries more weight than that English gloss suggests. In Sensale tradition, these were not just animals, they were a separate people, with their own territory, their own customs, and their own relationship to the land. That distinction shows up in nearly every indigenous tradition across the continent. The creatures were treated as a parallel population, not wildlife, not myth, but a kind of neighboring tribe that you respected, avoided, and didn't speak about lightly. That's a very different framework from how a folk monster usually gets described. The modern era of Bigfoot research really begins in 1924 with an incident known as the Ape Canyon attack. 5 miners, including a man named Fred Beck, were prospecting on the southeast flank of Mount St. Helens when, by their account, they shot at one of 2 large hair-covered creatures they spotted near a cliff face. That night, the creatures returned. They threw rocks at the miners' cabin for hours. Beck wrote a book about it 40 years later. The location is real. The cabin's foundation is still there. And the canyon has been called Ape Canyon to this day because of what those men reported. Then comes 1958, the moment Bigfoot got his name. A man named Jerry Crew, working as a bulldozer operator on a logging road in Bluff Creek, California, kept finding enormous human-like footprints around his equipment every morning. He finally made plaster casts. A local reporter named Andrew Genzoli wrote the story up in the Humboldt Times, and the headline coined the term Bigfoot. That story went national. 9 years later, in October 1967, Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin filmed the famous 23 seconds of footage in the same Bluff Creek area. Patient 1, sometimes called Patty, has been analyzed, scrutinized, debunked, and revalidated more times than I can count. Bill Munns did a 5K frame-by-frame restoration. Jeff Meldrum's foot morphology work suggests anatomically impossible features for a man in a suit. I covered all of this in detail in my video on modern Patterson-Gimlin analysis, so I won't relitigate it here. What I want you to take away from this section is the sheer scale of the North American evidence base. The BFRO database alone holds tens of thousands of credible sighting reports, meaning reports that survived investigator follow-up. The North American Wood Ape Conservancy, NAWAC, has been running multi-year field operations in the Ouachita Mountains of Oklahoma and Arkansas. Jeff Meldrum at Idaho State University maintains the largest scientific footprint cast collection in the world. eDNA studies, environmental DNA pulled from soil and water samples, are starting to find anomalous primate genetic material in remote forests, though those results are still preliminary and contested. I personally think Bigfoot has the largest, deepest, and most consistent evidence base of any cryptid in the world. Not because the creature is necessarily more real than the others, but because North America has more people, more cameras, more cars on remote forest roads, and a research community that has grown into something close to a small industry. The signal-to-noise problem is bigger here than anywhere else, but so is the signal. Now, here's where it gets interesting. If Bigfoot were the only one of these, we could dismiss the whole thing as a uniquely North American mythology, a campfire legend that grew along with the country. But Bigfoot is not the only one. Travel a quarter of the way around the world. Trade dense pine forests for thin air at 15,000 feet. Trade Salish elders for Sherpa monks. Trade the Cascades for the Himalayas. And the stories don't stop. They just change language. The Yeti. The earliest Western record of the Yeti, at least the one most historians point to, comes from a man named Brian Houghton Hodgson, the British resident in Nepal in 1832. Hodgson wrote of a wild man his porters had spotted in the mountains, covered in long dark hair, walking erect. He didn't know what to call it. He had no framework for it. He just recorded what they told him. But Hodgson wasn't documenting something new. He was documenting something that had been part of Sherpa and Tibetan oral tradition for centuries, possibly thousands of years. The Tibetan word Meto Kangmi translates roughly as man-like wild creature. There are also Merka, Migoi, meaning wild man, and Mishe, meaning man-bear. The name Abominable Snowman itself is a translation accident. In 1921, a British journalist named Henry Newman, writing in the Calcutta Statesman, accidentally rendered Meto as Mech, which translates closer to filthy. He invented the term abominable snowman for English-speaking readers, and it stuck. The most famous cryptid name in the English language is the result of a typo. I just want to sit with that for a second. The 20th century became the great age of Yeti expedition. In 1951, British mountaineer Eric Shipton, on a reconnaissance climb of Everest, photographed an enormous footprint in the snow near the Meldrum Glacier. The image went around the world. It is one of the most reproduced cryptid photographs in history. Whatever Shipton found, it became the spark that ignited every Yeti expedition that followed. In 1954, the British tabloid Daily Mail funded a major expedition that brought back hair samples from a sacred relic at the Pangboche monastery, an alleged Yeti scalp. The samples were analyzed by Professor Frederick Wood Jones, a respected anatomist, who concluded the hairs did not come from any known scalp pattern of any known animal. Then came the Slick expedition. Tom Slick was a Texas oil heir with money to burn and a serious interest in cryptozoology. He funded explorer Peter Byrne to go to the Himalayas in 1957 and 1958. While at Pangboche, Byrne pulled off one of the strangest cultural heritage thefts in cryptozoological history. He stole bones from the famed Pangboche hand, a mummified primate-like hand kept as a sacred relic in the monastery. He replaced the stolen bones with human bones to disguise the theft and arranged for the stolen pieces to be smuggled out of India. That smuggling operation involved actor Jimmy Stewart, the James Stewart. While passing through Calcutta in 1959, Stewart and his wife Gloria hid the Yeti finger bone in Gloria's lingerie case and flew it to London. They walked through customs without being checked because Jimmy Stewart was Jimmy Stewart. The bone reached Professor William Osman Hill, a primatologist at the Royal College of Surgeons. The results were inconclusive, initially classified as human but unusual. Decades later, in 2011, the BBC reported that modern DNA analysis had concluded the finger was, in fact, a human finger. In 1960, Sir Edmund Hillary, the man who had stood on top of Everest 7 years earlier, returned to the region with journalist Desmond Doig on a deliberate mission to find evidence of the Yeti. They borrowed the famous Khumjung monastery scalp with permission and a substantial donation and flew it to the west for analysis. The result? The scalp was made from the hide of a siro, a goat-like Himalayan antelope. So the two most famous physical Yeti relics in the world, the Pangboche hand and the Khumjung scalp, both came back from testing as something other than what they were claimed to be. That should be the end of the Yeti, right? Except it isn't. In 1974, a Sherpa woman named Lakpa Doma was tending yaks near the village of Machhermo, several days northwest of Pangboche on the trekking route to Gokyo. According to her account, a massive, hair-covered creature pushed her to the ground and slaughtered several of her animals. The locals examined the scene. They insisted it was not a bear. The event became one of the most chilling Yeti incidents in modern Nepalese folklore. What's striking about Lakpa Doma's account is the detail. She described the creature as roughly 5.5 feet tall, actually shorter than the typical Yeti depiction. Dark fur, a pronounced jaw. She said it grabbed her by the shoulder, pushed her down, and then went after her yaks one by one. 3 of them were killed, with their necks broken in a way that local hunters who later examined the scene said no bear they had ever encountered would have done. In 1986, Italian mountaineer Reinhold Messner, the first man to summit Everest without supplemental oxygen, a serious mountaineer with a serious reputation, had his own face-to-face encounter while trekking alone in eastern Tibet. He saw something that stood upright, walked, and made what he described as a terrifying whistling sound. That fleeting moment launched a 12-year quest during which Messner crisscrossed the Himalayas hunting his Yeti. His conclusion, published in his 2000 book, My Quest for the Yeti, was that the creature is actually a rare population of the Himalayan brown bear, Ursus arctos isabelinus, capable of walking upright. Local mythology, he believed, had transformed an unusual bear into a supernatural being. And then 2019, Indian Army mountaineers on a training exercise near Makalu Base Camp photographed a line of enormous footprints, each measuring 32 inches long by 15 inches wide. The Army's own official Twitter account posted the photographs and called them mysterious Yeti footprints. That set off a small diplomatic incident, but the prints were real and the photographs are public record. Here's what I want you to notice. Strip away the religious framing, the colonial era romance, the bad analyses, and the smuggled body parts. What you're left with is a creature described by Sherpa monks and Nepalese villagers and British mountaineers and Italian explorers and Indian Army officers over a span of 200 years from completely different vantage points. And the description is the same: tall, hair-covered, bipedal, reclusive. The same creature the Salish elders described 5,000 miles east, with no possible cultural contact between them.
2 cryptids down, and at least 2 more to go. But the next one is the one that historically gets ignored in these conversations. But I think it might be the one that actually proves the pattern.
January 1789. 18 months after the first fleet has dropped its convict cargo at Botany Bay. An article appears in a British periodical bearing the title, and I quote, "A description of a wonderful large wild man or monstrous giant brought from Botany Bay." The article describes a creature allegedly captured and brought to England that stood roughly 9 feet tall and was covered in hair from head to foot. That's the first European language reference to the Yowie, same year that George Washington was being inaugurated as the first president of the United States. But the Aboriginal people of Australia had been telling stories of the Yowie for thousands of years before any Europeans set foot on the continent. In different regions, it goes by different names: Yahoo, Quinkin, Dulargarl, Jugabina, Gindaring, Jurawara, Mingawin, Putikan, Gulaga, Yaroma, Pankarlangu, Jimbra, Jangara. More than 30 regional names across more than 30 distinct linguistic groups, every one of them describing the same general creature. 2 Aboriginal elders named Bungaree and Gunnedah gave 19th century researchers a phrase that I think is one of the most haunting in all of cryptozoology. They described the Yahoo as the original inhabitants of the Australian continent and said that many tribes of them had once existed. Let that sit for a second. The people who had lived on the continent for 40,000 years described another race of beings that came before them. There's another layer to the Aboriginal Yowie tradition that I think gets glossed over in cryptozoology coverage. In some Aboriginal traditions, the Yowie is part of the Dreamtime, the creation era mythology that underlies all of Aboriginal cosmology. That places the creature in a category that doesn't quite have an English equivalent, not quite an animal, not quite a spirit, not quite a person. A real being that exists in a different ontological register than European traditions assigned to flesh and blood creatures. That's part of why I think Aboriginal accounts deserve more weight than they typically get in Western cryptozoology. The tradition isn't a folk monster story, it's a cosmological one. And the warnings are remarkably consistent across regional traditions. Don't let children wander at night. The Yowie takes children, in many accounts, a detail that maps disturbingly well onto the missing 411 cluster patterns that David Paulides has documented in North American national parks. Same fear, different continent. Same warning given by mothers across thousands of years and thousands of miles. The geographic concentration of Yowie reports is striking. The vast majority of modern sightings come from eastern Australia, New South Wales, Queensland, and Victoria, with the Blue Mountains being a particular hotspot. The physical descriptions are nearly identical to Bigfoot, 6 to 10 feet tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair, sometimes reddish, sometimes black, arms that extend to or past the knees, a massive torso, and the same strong, musky smell that North American witnesses report. One of the most well-documented modern cases happened in 1979 in Kilcoy, Queensland, north of Brisbane. 2 teenage boys reported seeing a large ape-like creature standing at the edge of a forest. The incident gained enough public attention that the town later erected a wooden Yowie statue as a kind of tourist landmark. In December 2021, 3 men in Queensland reported a face-to-face encounter on a darkened street that they sketched for investigators afterward. The sketch matches every other description from the previous 2 centuries. I want to acknowledge something here because honest analysis is the whole point of this channel. There is a skeptical hypothesis worth taking seriously on the Yowie. In 1987, columnist Margaret Jones, writing in the Sydney Morning Herald, suggested that European Yowie reports may have been culturally seeded by the early 1800s arrival of captive orangutans in Britain, and that Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels with its hairy Yahoo creatures may have given the name. It's a clever argument and worth weighing, but it doesn't account for the Aboriginal traditions which long predate any orangutan exhibit in London. And it doesn't account for the fact that the description of the Yowie is consistent with both Bigfoot and the Yeti, neither of which could have been seeded by European cultural contact in Australia. If the orangutan import theory were correct, you would expect Yowie descriptions to more closely match orangutans. Reddish-orange hair, tree-dwelling, quadrupedal posture. That's not what witnesses report. They report a creature that stands fully upright, on the ground, that's gray or black or dark brown, and that walks like a man. Same creature, different continent, different millennium.
Real quick, if you've grown up hearing any of these names, or maybe any other regional name I haven't said yet, drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this thing actually stretches. And if you're new here, subscribe. The next section is the strangest of the 4.
Here's where it gets weird. If you've followed the channel for a while, you know I try to play things down the middle. Some cases I believe, some I don't. The Almas is the one I don't quite know what to do with because it doesn't fit the pattern of the other 3. The Almas is the wild man of Central Asia. The mountainous spine that runs from the Caucasus through the Pamirs of Tajikistan, the Tian Shan Range, the Altai Mountains, and east into Mongolia. The geography is harsh, remote, and almost completely empty of permanent human population. But the description of the Almas is unlike Bigfoot, the Yeti, or the Yowie, where the other 3 are described as ape-like, tall, massive, broad-shouldered, distinctly inhuman in posture. The Almas is described as something closer to a primitive human, 5 to 6.5 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown or dark hair, sloping forehead, heavy brow ridge, strong jaw, flat nose, dark skin. And this is the part that makes it different. Observed in some accounts wearing crude clothing, using simple tools, raiding fields, drinking from streams. The Almas isn't a forest ghost. The Almas is a neighbor. The historical record reaches back to the 15th century when chronicles from the era of Tamerlane mention wild, hairy men encountered in the mountains of Central Asia. But it was a Russian historian named Boris Porshnev who turned the Almas from folklore into something close to a scientific project. In the 1950s, Porshnev, working as part of a formal commission established by the Soviet Academy of Sciences, secured government approval to investigate the Almas phenomenon. In 1958, he led an expedition into the Pamirs of Tajikistan, joined by folklore experts, geologists, and botanists. The team collected eyewitness reports across the region between the Tian Shan, the Pamirs, and Mongolia. The final report ran 400 pages. That report sat in the archives of the Moscow Library for decades. Almost no one in the West had access to it. It was only translated into English much later by a small publisher in the UK, working from a copy provided by Porshnev's own grandson. Porshnev's hypothesis was startling. He believed the Almas was a relic population of Neanderthals, surviving in the most remote corners of the Eurasian landmass. That hypothesis has not aged perfectly. Modern science no longer believes Neanderthals were the dim, hair-covered brutes of 19th century imagination. They were highly intelligent, culturally sophisticated humans, and we now know that they interbred with our own ancestors and contributed real genetic material to modern Europeans and Asians. So a surviving Neanderthal in the form Porshnev imagined doesn't quite fit our current understanding. But there is one case that, even today, makes the Almas impossible to fully dismiss. Her name was Zana. In the 1850s, in a remote forest near the village of Takhina, in Abkhazia, a region wedged between the Caucasus Mountains and the Black Sea, local Prince Ashba of Kloy and his men captured what they described as a wild woman. She stood roughly 2 meters tall. She was completely covered in dark hair. She had a sloping forehead and a prominent jaw, and according to surviving accounts, her eyes were reddish in color. They could not communicate with her in any known language. They locked her up. She was treated by the standards of 19th century rural Abkhazia as something between a wild animal and a slave. Over the years, she gradually became more domesticated. She learned to perform simple tasks. She drank wine. She ate prepared food. She slept indoors. And she had children, at least 4 of them, fathered by local men. Most of her children died as infants. Several survived to adulthood, married locally, and had children of their own. One of her sons, named Quit, died in 1954. The local museum kept his skull. This is where modern science finally got involved. In 2013, British geneticist Brian Sykes, professor of human genetics at Oxford University, obtained samples from 6 of Zana's living descendants, as well as DNA extracted from Quit's preserved tooth and skull. His analysis, published in his 2015 book and as part of the Oxford-Lausanne Collateral Hominid Project, showed something genuinely surprising. Zana's DNA was 100% sub-Saharan African, specifically West African. Now, Sykes himself interpreted this as evidence that Zana was a member of a subspecies of modern humans whose ancestors had left Africa some 100,000 years before the main wave of human migration and had lived for 100 millennia in isolation, possibly in the remote Caucasus, possibly elsewhere. In other words, he was suggesting that Zana represented a kind of living evolutionary fossil. That conclusion has not held up well under scrutiny. Other geneticists, including the lead authors of a follow-up academic paper by Margarian and colleagues, pushed back hard. The simpler explanation, they argued, is that Zana was a West African woman, almost certainly a descendant of slaves brought to the Caucasus by the slave-trading Ottoman Empire, which controlled the region until the late 1850s. The Ottomans freed many of those slaves when Russian forces took over the region, and a small number remained in the area. Some of them, isolated in a foreign culture, may have lived semi-feral lives. Zana herself may have had a medical condition called hypertrichosis, a real documented condition that causes excessive hair growth across the entire body, combined with developmental disability and the brutal isolation of a wild upbringing. That is the most plausible explanation. I want to be clear about that. The honest answer is that Zana was almost certainly a human being whose tragic life became a cryptid story. But here's what bothers me about that resolution. Sykes was a professor of human genetics at Oxford. He had access to the same data that everyone else did. He looked at Zana's DNA, he looked at the descriptions, he looked at the skull of her son, and he didn't conclude she was a feral African woman with a hair condition. He concluded she was something else. He wasn't a cryptozoologist. He was an Oxford geneticist who had spent his career on mainstream evolutionary biology. And something in the data, something the rest of us are looking at from the outside, convinced him otherwise. I don't know what that something is, but it matters that he saw it. So, 4 creatures, 4 continents, 4 cultures with no possible contact across thousands of years, and yet a description that is, at the core, the same creature. There are 3 serious explanations for that pattern. Let me walk you through each. Explanation 1, a relic hominoid. This is the hypothesis advanced most prominently by Dr. Jeff Meldrum, the Idaho State University anthropologist who has spent his career on this question. In his book Sasquatch and Other Wildmen, The Search for Relict Hominoids, Meldrum argues that the pattern across continents reflects something real. He points out that the fossil record contains multiple hominin species that could plausibly have survived into the modern era in small isolated populations in exactly the kinds of remote terrain where these creatures are reported. Gigantopithecus blacki, the giant ape that lived in Southeast Asia until roughly 300,000 years ago. Homo erectus, which had a range extending across most of Eurasia. Paranthropus, Neanderthals, Denisovans. And the species that broke the case wide open in 2003, Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit, a small hominin discovered in a cave on the Indonesian island of Flores. Floresiensis survived until roughly 50,000 years ago, possibly more recently. The species was completely unknown to science until 22 years ago, and the field of human origins was forced to reckon with what its discovery meant. To understand why Floresiensis matters so much for this discussion, you have to understand what it actually was. We are not talking about a fossil from millions of years ago. We are talking about a hominin species, a member of the human family, that was alive on a small Indonesian island while modern humans had already begun developing agriculture in other parts of the world. They had stone tools, they had fire, they were small, only about 3.5 feet tall, but they were people. They hunted, they cooperated, they had recognizably human cognition. And nobody knew they existed until 2003. They survived alongside Homo sapiens for tens of thousands of years on an island that had been visited by anthropologists, mapped by colonial powers, walked by missionaries, and photographed by tourists. And the species was completely missed by science until 22 years ago. If you can hide an entire hominin species on a populated island like Flores in plain sight until the 21st century, then the idea that other hominin species might still be hiding in remote, uninhabited terrain doesn't seem absurd. It just seems unconfirmed. Henry G., the managing editor of the journal Nature, wrote an editorial after the Floresiensis find that has been quoted in cryptozoological circles ever since. He suggested that the discovery makes it more likely that stories of mythical human-like creatures, Yetis among them, could be founded on grains of truth. A senior editor at the most prestigious science journal in the world said that. Not a cryptid hunter. A senior editor at Nature. If multiple hominin species coexisted on Earth as recently as 50,000 years ago, which we now know for a fact they did, then the idea that isolated relic populations might have persisted in remote terrain into the historical era is not biologically impossible. It's just unconfirmed. Explanation 2. A cultural archetype. The skeptical counter-hypothesis is that the wild man is a universal human psychological pattern. We see it in mythology going back at least to the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, where Enkidu, a hair-covered wild man living among the animals, is one of the oldest characters in recorded literature. We see it in Greek satyrs. We see it in the medieval European wild man who appears in folk tales across the continent. We see it in Jonathan Swift's Yahoos. The argument is that humans everywhere project a fascination and a fear onto the not quite human, and that we collectively imagine the same creature because we share the same psychology, not because we share the same forest. The strongest scientific case for this is made in Daniel Loxton and Donald Prothero's book, Abominable Science, published by Columbia University Press in 2013. That argument is not wrong, but it doesn't fully explain the consistency of physical detail across cultures with no contact. Cultural archetypes vary, they mutate. Greek satyrs have hooves, medieval wild men are short. Enkidu is more human than animal. The Yowie, the Yeti, the Almas, and Bigfoot are described almost identically by witnesses who couldn't possibly have known each other. That's not how archetypes usually behave. Explanation 3. Misidentification. And here's the most important single piece of scientific work ever done on this question. In 2014, Brian Sykes, the same Oxford geneticist who later studied Zana, published the first peer-reviewed genetic survey of cryptid hair samples in Proceedings of the Royal Society B, one of the most respected biology journals in the world. He and his team collected 30 hair samples from Bhutan, India, Indonesia, Nepal, Russia, and the United States, samples attributed to Bigfoot, Yeti, and the Almas. They sequenced the mitochondrial DNA from each one. Every single sample matched a known mammal: bears, wolves, cows, raccoons, a Malaysian tapir, horses, porcupine, deer, sheep. One was human. Not a single sample was an unknown primate. That should be the end of the story, except for one anomaly. 2 of the samples from the Himalayas, one from Ladakh in northern India, one from Bhutan, matched the genetic signature of a 40,000-year-old polar bear that had been recovered from a fossil dig in Svalbard, Norway. Not a modern brown bear, an ancient polar bear from the Norwegian Arctic. Sykes initially hypothesized that this could represent an unknown bear species, possibly a polar bear and brown bear hybrid, living in the Himalayas and being mistaken for the Yeti. A 2015 follow-up paper by Edwards and Barnett argued that even that result was probably DNA degradation rather than a real ancient match. The debate is still going. But here's what Sykes himself said about all of it after his study was published, and I'm paraphrasing, because the spirit matters more than the exact wording. He said, in essence, this doesn't finish the Bigfoot myth at all. What it does is show that there is now a way for Bigfoot enthusiasts to go back out into the forest and bring back the real thing and prove it. A professor of human genetics at Oxford University, who had just spent 2 years rigorously disproving every single cryptid sample sent to him, said that.
Okay, so where does all of this leave us? Let me give you my honest take. Here's where I land after all of this. I think Bigfoot has the largest and most consistent evidence of any cryptids in the world. Not because the creature is necessarily more real than the others, but because North America has more people, more cameras, more rural land, and a more developed research community. The signal is the strongest in North America because the noise is also the loudest in North America.
The Yeti has the most physical artifacts, relics held in monasteries, hair samples sent to laboratories, footprints photographed by mountaineers. But every single one of those artifacts has failed under modern testing. The Khumjung scalp is a cerro. The Pangboche finger is human. The 2014 Sykes samples are bears. The footprints can be explained, at least in part, by quadrupedal bears walking in their own tracks. The Yeti has the most evidence and the weakest evidence simultaneously. I think the Yowie is the most underrated of the four. The Aboriginal tradition is the oldest, the deepest, and the most independent of European cultural influence. And the modern reports are consistent with both Bigfoot and the Yeti in ways that the cultural archetype hypothesis can't easily explain. The Yowie should be talked about more than it is. And the Almas is the one that keeps me up at night, because Zana was a real woman. Whatever she was, she existed. People remembered her. Her descendants have given their DNA to science. There's a skull in a museum in Abkhazia. Whatever happened to her, whether she was a hyper-trichotic feral woman of African descent or something stranger, it was real. The Almas, more than any of the others, brushes against the line where folklore stops being folklore and becomes biography. So here's my personal opinion, and you can take it for what it's worth. I think the four cryptids of this video are not the same animal. But I think they may be cousins, not in the sense of a single species crossing continents, but in the sense of multiple isolated relic populations of an ancestral hominin family that was once more diverse and more widespread than we currently believe. We know that diversity existed. Homo floresiensis proved it. We just don't know how recently the last representatives died out, or whether they died out at all. I also think that some percentage of these reports, maybe most of them, maybe almost all of them, are misidentifications. Bears walking upright, tricks of the light, cultural priming, sleep deprivation at high altitude, outright hoaxes. The skeptical case is strong, and I take it seriously, but most is not all. And I think the percentage that aren't misidentifications, that aren't hoaxes, that aren't cultural priming, that small remaining percentage matters. That's where the truth is. The strongest single argument for these creatures being real, in my opinion, is not any individual sighting. It's not the Patterson-Gimlin film, or the Shipton footprint, or the Kilcoy incident, or Zana. It's the pattern across cultures with no contact. 4 continents, 4 languages, 4 millennia, the same creature. Either humanity is hallucinating the same thing in the same way across every wilderness on Earth, which would itself be one of the strangest and most important facts in the history of psychology. Or these reports are pointing at something real. I don't know which it is, but I know it deserves more than dismissal.
That's where I land. You do not have to agree with me, but I would love to hear what you think in the comments. If you've experienced anything that fits the profile of any of these 4, maybe a Sasquatch in a North American forest, the Yeti at altitude in the Himalayas, a Yowie in the Australian bush, or an Almas in the Caucasus or anywhere else in Central Asia, please drop it in the comments down below. Let's have a discussion.
This channel reads them, I read them. And the most important Bigfoot videos I've ever made started from someone else's encounter posted in a comment section, so don't hold back. If you're new to this channel and you want to go deeper, 3 videos I'd recommend in this order. The Native Elder Prophecy video for the deep North American context. The Albert Ostman captivity essay for the historical record. And the Highway 210 911 call breakdown for the cryptid lane just outside Sasquatch territory. Together, those 3 videos plus this one will give you a global picture of what we're actually dealing with. I'm probably going to do a follow-up at some point on the cryptids I didn't cover today. The orang pendek of Sumatra, the small one, sometimes called the Sumatran Yeti. The mapinguari of the Amazon. The chuchunaya of Siberia. The skunk ape of Florida. There's enough material there for another full video, maybe more. Let me know in the comments if you want me to go that direction next. Every culture that has ever known a forest has reported a man in it. That's not nothing. I'm Alex. See you in the next one.